Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the University of Washington College of Forest Resources, I wish to welcome all of you to this 14th Denman Forestry Issues series entitled Sustainable Urban Ecosystems, Human Dimensions and Management. We look forward today to an exciting and informative program as we begin to investigate a series of issues dealing with natural and environmental resources found in urban and urbanizing regions of our state and beyond. In visualizing the size, the ecological diversity, and land use pressures of the Pacific Northwest region, picture in your mind the gradient of land use change as we proceed from, say, downtown Seattle, Everett, Tacoma, or Portland, eastward through the foothills of the Cascades and out into the forest lands that lie to the east. Or picture yourself in one of those cities and move westward out towards the Pacific Ocean. This window box to wildlands land use gradient depicts the pressures that an urbanizing society creates on the natural systems of our region and is one of the purposes we are gathered here today to discuss ways that we might sustain our urban ecosystems as these pressures mount. This subject is in keeping with the purpose of the Denman Forestry Issues series, which is to provide information and discussion on timely forestry and natural resource issues facing our region. As with all the activities associated with an academic setting, our ultimate goal is to inform and to educate our students, our faculty, and our staff, as well as resource professionals, citizens groups, landowners, and the general public. These programs are made possible through the generous support provided by the Denman Endowment for Student Excellence in Forest Resources. And they support the college's vision as a world-class and internationally recognized source of knowledge relevant to environmental and natural resource issues. The mission of our college is to study and investigate the sustainability and functionality of complex natural resource and environmental systems in both natural and managed environments using an interdisciplinary approach across multiple spatial and temporal scales to include our urban, suburban, and wildland landscapes. In our college, we focus on programs in sustainable forestry, sustainable urban ecosystems, and sustainable forest enterprises. Sustainability serves as the goal for all of our programs and includes all resources such as timber, plants, water, wildlife, or insects, for example. Also considers the needs of future generations as well as those of us present today, and strives for a dynamic equilibrium or balance across the ecological functions and conditions along with social and economic factors. Now today, we wish to focus on a variety of issues related to the creation and maintenance of sustainable urban ecosystems or urban environments. We will hear presentations covering the impact of development on urban ecosystems, interactions between urban ecosystems and humans, management issues related to urban parks and urban forests, and the role of botanic gardens in our urban environments. Taken together, these topics involve the exploration of issues that we collectively refer to under the banner of urban ecology. Now, urban ecology is a subfield of ecology which deals with the interaction of plants, animals, and humans with each other and with their environment in urban or urbanizing settings. Urban ecology also involves the study of the effects of urban development patterns on ecological conditions and economic and ecosystem services. Important components of urban ecology that we will discuss today are topics in urban horticulture, botanic gardens, urban parks, and urban forests. The Urban Ecology Program and the University of Washington Botanic Gardens here at the University of Washington are examples of academic programs which embody these these elements. Community programs supported by local governments and non-governmental organizations engage policymakers, scientists, and citizens as they address real-world management issues. Both of those topics will be discussed during the presentations today. Today, our program covers a range of social management and ecological aspects of sustaining our urban ecosystems. The physical and biological aspects were discussed in an earlier Denman program. With us today to discuss these and other topics are speakers from city government and nonprofit organizations. Our topic again is sustainable urban ecosystems, human dimensions, and management. And our moderator is Professor Sarah Reichert from the University of Washington College of Forest Resources and the University of Washington Botanic Gardens. Sarah?
Thank you, Dean Beer. Good afternoon, and welcome to the University of Washington Botanic Gardens. We're going to be talking about management in sustaining urban ecosystems. Our first speaker is Stacy Ray. She is an urban forestry program specialist in community planning and development for the city of Olympia and for the city of Kirkland. So that's quite a commute she's got. She has a Bachelor of Science from the College of Forest Resources with a specialty in environmental horticulture and urban forestry from the University of Washington. She's going to be speaking on comprehensive management of urban forest systems in the Puget Sound area.
I'd like to share with you today an overview of the comprehensive management of urban forest systems in the Puget Sound area. I say overview because, as Kathy mentioned earlier, it'd be virtually impossible to talk about everything. So, as an urban forester for the city of Olympia, my responsibilities and challenges are extremely diverse, and I think we'd be here all night if I tried to talk about everything. So, I'm going to mention the points that are extremely exciting and interesting and challenging, as I said earlier. So, to borrow from a now famous analogy, managing an urban forest is definitely like a box of chocolates. When the phone rings each day, we don't know what we're going to get, and that is truly the excitement of the job. So I'm going to use my experience in Olympia to go ahead and highlight some of the challenges and the thrills. So traditionally, the urban forest is often defined as trees that are still growing in a forest-like situation. Where do we see this most often? Parks, green belts, and remnant forest patches. But in my role, I'm engaged in managing an urban forest that encompasses much more than what you typically define as a traditional. So that will include riparian areas, include steep slopes. I just want to mention these are all actually taken in Olympia or the urban growth area. That will include parking lots. That will include street trees, downtown and residential areas, school grounds, and finally, the trees in your yard. So I have broken up the management of an urban forest system into preservation and retention of trees and the adding of new trees. So I'll start by addressing preservation and retention. The forests and trees in our region provide an identifying shared sense of place and a regional character. Preservation and retention of our native tree species and also our non-native mature trees is becoming increasingly vital and yet also increasingly challenging. What can't be ignored in almost every city in our region is the strong growth in the home market and in population, and also the purposeful statewide mandate to increase density in urban areas. So, if this is often the new norm, are trees and density in conflict? At first glance, the thought is, well, where are the trees? And also, where is there space for trees? When land is cleared for new development, what we are continually asked by the surrounding community is, why can't we build homes among the trees? Why are trees not saved on individual lots? And unfortunately, the nature of a construction site is one that turns the natural soil conditions upside down and around and topsy-turvy, and it's just not the same. The conditions that a Douglas fir or western red cedar need to survive, let alone thrive, simply no longer exist on that individual lot. So when you are looking at preservation on single lots, you must consider the tree health. Was that tree in good condition in the first place? The species of the tree. Is that species capable of surviving those kinds of changing conditions? Tree protection. Was the tree in its root zone adequately protected during construction, meaning was it not compacted? Was the grade not changed? And was it not disturbed? And finally, will this tree be successful? And here's the key. Will it be successful 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and 30 years from now? An urban forester has to be prepared to accept no for an answer and has to be prepared to make that judgment call. So in Olympia, what the community is seeing most right now is the clearing of huge swaths of land. And we're talking 100 acres for potentially 800 dwelling units. And down the street from 80 acres and 600 dwelling units, and around the corner from another 100 acres and 500 dwelling units. This is the reality right now in Olympia. Is the whole site cleared? No. Required remnant forest patches are often the preservation solution in these situations. And picture it as an example of this. No trees were left on the single lots, but a stand was retained at the far end of the development. But the preservation of remnant stands needs to be under close management. Sometimes after clearing, they can look like this. This particular stand exists in a development that's called evergreenhills.com. When this is what is potentially being preserved, the safety and integrity of the stand needs to be closely examined. Consider, again, is the stand healthy and is it dense? Are there pockets of existing root rot or other diseases that have already weakened this stand? And if it was dense, will the trees left on the outer edge be prone to failure? Tree species. If the species is that species prone to failure under those new conditions? Stand protection. Again, was the stand protected adequately during construction, including the root zone? And proximity to homes. Will there be homes built directly next to this stand? Would you feel comfortable living next to that stand? And future use. Will the stand be used as a recreational space for that neighborhood, or will it be set aside as natural as it can be? Both future uses will vary in how the stand should be managed today. So what's the solution in Olympia? It's tree tracts. New residential development is required to preserve remnant stands, which are referred to as tree tracts in the city's tree ordinance, which was adopted in 1991. The ordinance requires a minimum tree density of 30 tree units. If newly planted, that's 30 trees per acre. So in the case of a 100-acre urban village, like we're seeing coming in at this time, 300 tree units are required. At least 75% of the required tree density must be preserved in tree tracts. In addition to that, all new streets must have street trees installed in a planting strip. The end result is a preserved remnant stand and tree-lined streets in new development. The ordinance also explicitly states that the trees to be preserved must be healthy, they must be wind firm, and they must be appropriate to the site at their mature size. While parts of Olympia might look like the building boom of a gold rush, that's what it feels like, there are older areas of the city that are seeing revitalization and infill. But what if the current zoning conflicts with trees? This situation is best described by use of an example. This is Pacific Avenue in Olympia, an old highway that is seeing leapfrog redevelopment along its frontage. In 1986, the zoning requirement was a 6-foot sidewalk, which meant that these ash trees were planted behind the walk. There was no room in the walk. So fast forward to today. New commercial office space is being built under the new and current zoning. What does that mean? Well, it calls for buildings to be pushed all the way up to the back of the walk. It leaves no space for trees. And if the sidewalk, this is important, and if the sidewalk is in good repair, it does not need to be replaced or widened. What do? So where do the trees go? There's no longer room behind the walk, and ADA requirements prevent them from going into the sidewalk in grades. Part of managing an urban forest, and this is what I wanted to make this point, this example, is we don't have necessary answers to this, but part of managing an urban forest is understanding zoning and working closely with the planning department. The cities are designed for trees. Preservation and retention of trees also involves ensuring that trees that currently exist in the city right-of-way are safe. To be considered hazardous, a tree must be two main things. One is in poor condition and prone to failure, but also must be in close proximity to a potential target, and a target being something that could cause damage to people or property. So what we're discovering the hard way in Olympia is that the denser the city becomes, the more targets are being created, whether that be homes, cars, dog houses, trails, walkways. We're just seeing more of that happening. Consequently, our requests for removals on city property are rising, becoming more and more prevalent. And because of available resources, we have no choice right now to be retroactive. On the left is what the community sees. It's a beautifully tree-lined street. What I see is a row of severely topped trees that are prone to doing what happened on the right. And I ask, who should be responsible? Because these trees are in the right-of-way. A tricky gray area for municipalities, there can be. In some cities, the abutting homeowner is solely responsible for the tree in the right-of-way. In Olympia, our program has set a precedent that the city will maintain the trees in the right-of-way. There's no right answer, except that street tree safety is a very large aspect of managing the urban forest system. So management of a system also means growing it. As we know, trees offer a vast array of benefits. So what urban forest management program is complete without a tree planting program? Olympia's NeighborWoods program is just that and more. And program coordinator, Mickey McNaughton, who's pictured here, pushes every year to plant at least 500 trees throughout the city. That goal is often reached because the program is based on community member participation and learning, which fosters incredible community investment. Mickey works with neighborhood groups through planting events and work parties. She often successfully empowers a community to proactively manage the urban forest in their own neighborhood. Special events raise awareness and bring out a diverse section of the community for educational opportunities. Mickey recently coordinated a demonstration planting of 17 different tree species that will live happily under utility wires. Growing the urban forest means installing street trees along major arterials. This is Harrison Avenue in Olympia, pictured before and after the installation of 110 new street trees. The City of Olympia Urban Forestry Program is housed in the Community Planning and Development Department, which means that all new development is reviewed for compliance with the city tree ordinance. And that includes both commercial and residential development. Now, our program has recently launched an educational campaign with funding from the USDA Forest Service and the Washington State DNR. And it specifically aims to eliminate the devastating practice of tree topping. This may fit under tree preservation as well as tree planting, but too often we see that commercial landscapes where the wrong trees were planted in the first place, in the wrong place, encourage future incidents of topping. So finally, from a municipal perspective, the comprehensive management of an urban forest system is wholly for the community's best interest. That's what I do every day. I make decisions, I form relationships, and I get creative with solutions, all in the best interest of the community. And it sounds pretty straightforward, but the community is made up of many different interests, and they don't always align with one another. Management of an urban forest system is so much more than working directly with trees. An urban forester is often a teacher, a planner, an arborist, a facilitator, a risk manager, and most of all, a spokesperson for the trees that share with us an increasingly dense urban environment. So what's the future of comprehensive urban forest management in Olympia? Neighborhood planning. I believe the future is in developing neighborhoods and communities that will take an active role in the stewardship and management of their community asset. It takes a village to raise a child, but it also takes a community to raise a safe, healthy, and diverse urban forest. So, thank you.
All right, well, as Stacy has pointed out, managing trees in an urban environment is a very complicated job, and our next speaker is going to elaborate on that some more. Our next speaker is Mark Mead. He's the Senior Urban Forester for the City of Seattle's Department of Parks and Recreation. He has over 20 years' experience working in municipal, utility, and production forestry with a number of different agencies with the city, county, state, and federal agencies. As Forester of Seattle Parks, he manages 2,500 acres of forested area and over 100,000 trees on developed parklands. Mark has a Bachelor of Science degree from the College of Forest Resources at the University of Washington and has had graduate coursework here at the Center for Urban Horticulture. And he will be speaking on Seattle's forest restoration program.
Thank you very much for coming. This afternoon we're going to be talking about the restoration of urban forest. And not necessarily the entire forest, but specifically the forest remnants in the city of Seattle. And the issues that we're going to be bringing up today have to do with a model of sustainability and how this model can be utilized by any municipality in any situation similar to this throughout the urban environment. And what we're going to be focusing on is how the community, the resources that we have within that community, evolve into a commitment to making a change. Seattle a century ago was forested. Very shortly thereafter, it wasn't. The city itself evolved from the extraction of resources, and specifically, as I was told just recently, it started in Alki with the removal of pole logs to help supplement the new community. Resources in Seattle also, at the same time that we were developing these forests, ideas from back east, from the east coast of Washington, or east coast of the United States, became more and more prevalent, and that was the retention of areas for recreation. And that at the same time that we were cutting our forests down and developing this area, we were looking for restoration, and we were looking for retention of areas for livability in the city. And this evolved from the Olmsteds, the grandfathers of landscape architecture as we know it. The idea is that we would retain areas for recreation to bring livability, sustainability within the city, within the area, to the people that lived within the city. During the course of that time, since that time, Seattle has required over 6,200 acres of land for parks. Of that, almost half of it is in forest and natural areas. It's a very significant point to miss during the acquisition, is that a majority of those forested areas were acquired under the idea that they did not require funding. They did not need to be maintained. This is a very important fact, and this will carry through as we go into the next level of investigation. Seattle's forests today, many of the areas that we have, when they were logged, regrew. When they regrew with what we call secondary forest and early successional forest. Terminology meaning that the trees grow up fast, die young. And over 100 years, these trees have reached the peak of their lifetime and are beginning to decline. We have a vision for this forest. This vision is for the entire urban forest. And one of the principal things about this, if you look past all the different words that are up there, is the last word. One of the most important words. And this has to do with a paradigm shift in urban forests and a paradigm shift of how things are dealing with in terms of long-term management and sustainability. And that is the word asset. And the important reason that we use that term asset is because we, in the urban environment, have a lot of different uses for land. And a majority of these different uses have some level of conflict or some level of overlap with the rest of the land. And in particular, when we look at the natural areas and watersheds that we have within the urban environment, they are, as we've already talked about, a fairly significant level of land that for the most part were not developable at the time that we acquired them. They are now developable. And these areas, as the science begins to improve, we need to understand that these areas need to be retained and improved, not just because they are nice places to go, but that they actually have a value. And one of these things that we look at in terms of that value is the amount of canopy. We have new technology that allows us to measure how much canopy we have in the city. And what we found is that, if we looked at the city of Seattle, that we have over 18% canopy across the entire city. That 18% canopy, a majority of that area that that canopy is in parks or forested areas. So we need to retain those areas. But the problem that we have with the forests is that in urban areas is that we're not talking about values that are easily quantifiable. We're no longer talking about the same level of extraction before. We're not talking about the same values that we can actually put numbers and cents to. That they actually understand also is that the community responds directly to these issues, and not just because they feel that this is something they want to do, but because they feel something viscerally. There is something that is inherent in having green in this area, and that one of the most important things that we're talking about is driving this paradigm is that we have to move from an amenity value for parks to an imperative. And by imperative, what I'm saying is that it's important that we understand that green is incredibly important to the livability of our cities, to the sustainability of our cities. If we're going to keep people out of our undeveloped areas, the forested areas out in the fringe areas, we're going to have to make our cities more and more livable. And this imperative carries through in terms of how we manage those areas. We've already seen a talk today here about maintaining the safety of our forest in the urban environment. But at the same time, we need to make changes. I underline the word increase because this is the only word that I put into our tree policy that we established back in 2001 when we rewrote it. The only word that I improved or added to the tree policy was the word increase, and that we were looking to increase overall urban forest canopy and not just maintain, enhance, or preserve the existing canopy that we had, and that would be necessary for us to increase the canopy that we had. At the same time, as we look through the policies and as we move forward in urban forest management, we talk about the idea that this is valuable green infrastructure and that this green infrastructure is actually an asset. And I continue to use that word because it's very important when we start to look at the idea of defining an area and maintaining it in a sustainable manner. Very interestingly, at the same time that we were developing our work and trying to work forward to this, a new model of urban forest sustainability evolved and came forth in 1997. And the idea behind this is that you have to understand three elements of the urban environment, three components, and these are essential to how this forest is managed. First is that you must understand the resource itself. What is the forest components? How is it built? The second part is the actual management infrastructure that we have within the city. Now, in the city of Seattle, there are 7 distinct entities, 7 distinct departments that have some level of control over trees in the city. This is very important to understand because it can be complex, it can be a little confusing, and it's certainly very frustrating to anybody that asks a question about what happens with the tree in their backyard. The last thing, and actually the most important thing to deal with and understand in the community, any area of this part, is the community. And how is this community structured? What allows them to be involved? What are the triggers for them? And what are the things that we are going to allow them to move forward and help us with this program? The most important thing about this urban forest sustainability model is that it recognizes several very, very distinct things about the urban forest that separates it from the forest that we know, the logged forest or the national forest, parklands. That first, this forest must be actively managed, that it can no longer be left to its own devices, that we must take an active involvement in this forest and how it's going to be retained, and that the community support is essential, that it cannot support itself without people being part of that structure. In 1993, Seattle Parks found that there was a lot of people in their forest doing a lot of different things and a lot of good things that they wanted to do. The concept willy-nilly was applied simply because we did not know what really needed to be done. And in fact, most of the people that were out there were doing what they thought was the best thing for the environment, and we had to find a way to measure or take that forest and control that forest. Once again, we began to understand that this forest is an asset, and that as an asset, that these folks, these people, these citizens, these volunteers were assets as well. And one way that we're going to be able to find out how to maintain these forests is that we're going to have to work with all those different elements. We already knew that the forest was in decline, that development has already taken over a great deal of the forest. In the last 30 years, we've already lost 60% of the forest that we had. We began to understand that the forest itself was in serious decline. And why was it in serious decline? Well, first off, those trees I talked about earlier, they're early successional trees. We've reached the end of their lifespan. They're beginning to die off. We've also introduced a number of and a host of non-native species. We have, actually in the city of Seattle, almost 70% of our forested lands have some level of invasive species in them, principally heterohelix, English ivy, and Himalayan blackberry. The complex that evolves from this is that since we no longer have a conifer overstory, we don't have a seed source. That seed source, if it was there, would be hampered by those invasive species. And so what we have found is actually that our forest is dying, and that is actually quickly on a course towards death. And as our mayor, who has become actually a principal element in terms of the development of this of our land and retaining it, is mentioned and just recently has made a statement that he will support our urban forest to a greater extent than we ever have in the past, and that the city that we know now is formally going to become the urban forest. One of the things that we looked at in terms of how this forest is managed is that as we manage these forests, we begin to look at the values that we have. Management requires the concept of values. And one of the things that is very important for us as we're going through this is to, in terms of economic value, is how are we going to determine those economic values, and how do we gain credibility within the urban environment, and how do we inside the decision-making structure. And that one of the things that's very important to understand is that when you talk about values, is that your values must exceed your cost, and that it's much, much easier in an urban environment to understand cost, because costs are what comes out of your pocket. The cost for maintaining a tree, the cost for trees falling on a house, the cost for actually going out and developing the land. These costs are much more easily understood. So we started to look at some of the values that are out there. And one of the things that we determined, or we found from actually forest studies that are out there, is that if you were to remove all the forest in the city of Seattle, you would have to build over $220 million of rainwater or stormwater management infrastructure to retain the same amount of water, stormwater that forest maintained. The next thing that we found out is that the forest actually sequesters carbon, and that an actual acre of conifer forest will retain a ton of carbon per year. This is fairly important because we're starting to talk about carbon credits and what the value is in the forest and the value it is to the citizens of Seattle. The next thing that we looked at is that as these lands, and we've seen earlier today, is that these lands provide over a 15% increase in value to the property by their proximity. Now, this is very important for most people to understand, is that even though the forest is a passive entity in most people's environment, in most people's life, is that they will sustain and they will purchase land at a higher value directly adjacent to these greenlands. Finally, when we looked at these recommendations, we start to look at and identify, when we start to look at these three elements, we had to go out and find three ways, these three elements, is that we needed to find an identifiable resource, some reliable funding sources. We need to look at our community resources and develop a volunteers program that's going to be able to be implementable. We needed to find financial support from outside through our community, and we need to look at the resource assessments and build a better and stronger program. One of the best ways that we looked at is the first thing that we looked at was our major maintenance plan. When we talk about assets and infrastructure, if we were able to convince people that this is an actual asset, that it would fit into our major maintenance plan, just like any other structure that we had. This allowed us to get $150,000 in funding. That $150,000 allowed us to place these assets and go out and work with the communities and fund actively interested volunteers to go out and do this work and to start to investigate the work that we're doing. We found out that with that funding, we could get them to leverage about 300 to 500% of that through granting and funding. And we also found out that we were able to generate support through our voters. We had 4,000 people out working in these fields, And that translates into executive decision making because those people are the ones that impact the decision making. The voters impact our decision makers. We looked at 50,000 volunteer hours annually. We also developed new tools for resource assessment. And this is very important because we didn't know what we were doing, as we mentioned earlier. And the important part about this is that as we were doing the development of this resource, we were out investigating and handing and developing a set of best management practices that allowed us, through these forest management plans, individual forest management plans that we did, that it allowed us to look at the forest as an overall entity and how this forest was impacting, being impacted by invasive species. What we found is that we could get an early start. We can get a jump on what's going on out in the field. That through these best management practices that we were able to understand and get a better handle on and control the ivy that we had out there, and to take a look at the field practices that we could share with other entities out in the field. These best management practices actually turned into dollar values and actually allowed us to take that same paradigm that we're talking about, this idea that we have capital investment that we need to put in forward to this project to allow people to understand that this is a capital asset that needs to be enhanced through capital money. Once that capital money is taken, is invested, that we'd be able to go forward with what we call opportunity or maintenance and operation costs. And those operation and maintenance costs will go into perpetuity. But the idea is that you have to first get the infrastructure, that particular asset, up to maintainable capabilities. And that's where this capital investment came in. So here we are. We have a model, and that's the urban forest sustainability model. We have concerned citizens. They're out working with us. We have a city executive that is behind us. We have a program that has evolved to a point where we actually have resources, we have best management practices, we have educated community, and finally, we have a partner, and that's Cascade Land Conservancy, a step forward. All this combined together created the Green Seattle Partnership, and my partner from that will be stepping forward. John Floberg will be discussing how the Cascade Land Conservancy and the City of Seattle have come together to implement the Green Seattle Partnership. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. That's great. All right. Well, Mark provided an excellent segue to this next talk. John Floberg is Vice President of Stewardship at the Cascade Land Conservancy, which is a regional land trust based in Washington. Prior to joining the Cascade Land Conservancy, he worked for the Nature Conservancy in eco-regional planning and stewardship. He's also worked for the North Cascades National Park as a wildlife biologist and as a field biologist in the Channel Islands of California. He also has a master's degree from the University of Vermont's Field Naturalist Program and a Master of Business Administration from Rochester Institute of Technology. And he's going to be talking about restoring urban forests through the Green Seattle Partnership.
Good afternoon. The Green Seattle Partnership is a public-private venture between the City of Seattle, the Cascade Land Conservancy, and most importantly, and that's why I put it first on this slide, the citizens of Seattle. There was a kickoff event on Earth Day 2004 with Mayor Nichols and Cascade Land Conservancy President Jean Duvernoy. So this presentation will consist of, first of all, answering the question, why would a regional land trust be interested in urban forest restoration? And then looking into what are the consequences of not doing urban restoration and the solution, restoration through the partnership. Then I'll describe the nuts and bolts of the partnership, what are the goals and vision, methods, and then costs and funding sources, and then finally follow up with what you can do to help us with the Green Seattle Partnership. So first of all, why is a regional land trust interested in urban forest restoration? Well, quite simply, and you probably can guess from seeing these presentations today, we need to make our cities great places to live. In protecting rural lands and looking at resource lands and trying to do something about sprawl, we need to make our cities magnets. They need to be attractive places to take those, a large percentage of the millions of people that are expected to come here and reweave that green fabric back into our cities. And a large part of that is restoring our urban forests. And so that's why the Cascade Land Conservancy is involved in this effort. And Also, we've already seen some of this, but if we do nothing, we've heard about the canopy in decline, we've heard about the native understory species that are disappearing, and the lack of tree generation of the native trees. And so in 20, 50, 100 years, we have this scenario of monoculture of just a few species and the loss of many things, including ecosystem services. And so the partnership's goal is to reverse that trend, and to do something in the short and the long term in order to bring back forests that are important for services, for the community. But why do we need a new big restoration effort? Isn't the Parks Department working with volunteers to restore the forest anyway? Well, it's really an issue of scale. The Seattle Urban Nature Project, which Mark talked about earlier, identified 2,500 acres, 2,500 in Seattle that needs to be restored. And so at the rate pre-partnership of about 9 acres of restoration a year, it would take over 200 years to be able to do the restoration. And for those of you that know how invasive species work, this would quickly outpace the efforts of the pre-partnership level of energy. And so now we have this partnership. This is the first page of the 52-page booklet of the strategic plan, and this talk consists of all the pieces of that plan. The vision of the plan is pretty straightforward: a sustainable urban forest. But again, it's not about the Parks Department and a few volunteers. It's about the whole community benefiting and participating in that urban forest restoration. The goals, pretty ambitious. In 20 years, restore 2,500 acres and ensure sustainability. So it's not just that 20 years, but it's looking out beyond to do the maintenance, to be able to do the monitoring, so that there is a sustained level of attention to it. This is the piece that is often forgotten in looking at restoration work. And most importantly, engaging the community, because the community is the beneficiary, and the community is also very necessary. We get 300 to 500% leverage for each dollar we spend working with volunteers. And the Seattle Public Utilities, the Seattle Parks, has a great volunteer program. They get 40 to 50,000 hours of work each year, but this needs to be ramped up. This needs to be doubled or even tripled to be able to achieve the goals of the Green Seattle Partnership. So how do we do this methodologically? Well, we need to take strategic action. We have lots of different disparate efforts across the city, but we need to prioritize for starters. Look at the greatest value, look at the greatest threat. We need to coordinate better and track our progress. We also need to look at those best management practices that Mark mentioned and implement them and educate people to use them. And again, as I mentioned before, raise the public awareness so that we can get the numbers of volunteers that we need. And then finally, look at the funding sources to develop community campaign money, as well as a long-term mechanism for city funding. So where do we begin? These red circles represent all of the 2006 work areas in the city of Seattle. So how did we choose these? Well, again, forests of greatest value, forests of greatest threat, but there are other considerations as well. For instance, we want to support those groups that are already out there, the communities that have volunteer groups. We want to look at the geographic distribution of our work and make sure that underserved communities have a chance to participate, other communities, so that you can essentially go to your backyard and be able to go and participate in this effort and see the benefits. And also political feasibility and opportunity. So if we were to look at just the value and the cost, value and the threat aspect, we could take all of the acres in Seattle, and the 2,500 that need restoration, and put them on this chart, this sort of a scatter plot, where we have various boxes of prescriptions based on the number of acres of condition, different conditions based on different levels of value, different levels of threat. Increasing values are associated with increasing percent evergreen, as well as increasing percent native tree species. And then the threat axis, left to right, increases with increasing percent invasive cover. And so you see all of these boxes The upper right, for example, major invasive plant reduction is necessary because that has the highest level of invasive threat and also the greatest value. So if we were to depict this pictorially, you can see in that upper right, there's an evergreen forest that's been invaded by ivy. In the upper left, we have an evergreen forest without that invasive problem, and everything in between. The goal, and these red numbers are the acres of that roughly 2,500 acres. The goal is over that 20-year period to move all of those acres up into the upper left box so that in year 20, we have 2,500 in that box. If we were to look at a specific example, just for the value component, let's take Carkeek, for example. Look at the value based on forest composition at Carkeek. Greater percentage evergreen, lesser percentage evergreen, deciduous, as well as native tree diversity, and then put that together with the threat axis, invasive cover. Less than 5% constitutes low threat, 5 to 50 medium, and so on. We have to put these into bins, and that's how they end up in that matrix. And then we superimpose the invasive cover over the forest condition so that we can see, for example, in that dark green area with the cross-hatching, the area of greatest value and greatest threat. And we might concentrate there first, for example. Discovery Park's a nice park to look at because it has lots of different forest types. And we can demonstrate the different management regimes, if you will, associated with this site analysis in this color coding on the left. And you can see this is all combined with the rectangles in the site analysis corresponding to the photos, corresponding to the areas in the ground for treatment. So this is sort of the macro view of how do we choose where we work next. But then once we get there, once we get on the ground, what do we do to do the restoration? How do we get from the to the after point from the before? Well, according to the best management practices that Mark mentioned, there are 4 phases. The first phase is the most intense and is over half of the effort and half of the expense, which is basically removing the invasive species. If in the case of ivy, it could be rolling these ivy rolls, laying them on cardboard and having them desiccate and die. And in the case of trees, cutting survivor rings around them to sever the link between the upper vine and the ground. The second phase, which takes place ideally in the fall, is the fall planting and some limited hand weeding, but the focus is on planting. The third phase, that's where you're taking care of what you've planted, you're watering, you're mulching, you're also potentially laying down cardboard and suppressing the growth of, again, invasive species. And then phase 4, the forgotten phase. This is the part that is the long-term maintenance and monitoring. And this is perpetuity. This is forever. So that's why it's so essential in this effort, not only to be aggressive now and get the job done, but to have that funding stream, to have managers realize that this is something that needs to be allocated for, and people need to be aware that this is crucial to maintain the healthy forest. So remember the Discovery Park triage example where we had the colored boxes representing the different management prescriptions? Well, we could actually take that same thing and look at the average price for treating each of these acres in the different conditions, each color representing a different one of these conditions. And if we took an average of all of these, it's about $20,000 per acre. And a total for the 20-year period is a $52 million expense. Mark showed this during his presentation, but this is the funding structure of the partnership. It's a 20-year endeavor. That first green part underneath the orange-yellow line is a community campaign that the Cascade Land Conservancy is responsible for, raising $3 million. And then the orange line crests at about $3 million at the height of the campaign and then decreases. But you'll notice it doesn't reach 0. As I mentioned, there's that phase 4 that's so important. So I want to invite all of you out to Green Seattle events. They're throughout the city. They're more than 20 a month. They're in a neighborhood near you, and they allow you to do hands-on urban reforestation, invasive removal. Do it for Seattle. Do it for our future. And as St. Thomas Aquinas said, it's pleasure that motivates us, and it's delight. And this is an activity that will, I promise you, give you that delight. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that concludes our presentation about management and sustainable urban ecosystems.